Greetings and welcome to the Den. I'm Wolf Bear and I'm here today to shout out Autism Acceptance Month and talk about my autistic character, Andra. AKA, I'm gonna ramble nonsensically about the little people I've invented inside my head because my characters and stories definitely aren't a hyperfixation for me. Yes, I'm living in denial. Now, before we get started here, I've got a few things to clarify. I am not an expert on autism. I'm not even officially diagnosed, though I've suspected myself autistic for years, which involved a whole lot of excessive research, self doubt, and many autistic friends telling me I have the vibe. Autistic people just have a radar for finding each other. If you know, you know. But my point is, I am not all knowing, and I am not perfect. Neither is my character, but we don't need to be perfect. We just need to be respectful. And either way, autism is a spectrum, and it looks different for everyone, so it would be impossible for me or anyone to make a character that is 100% perfect and a universal depiction of autism. Andra, who is one of the main characters in a fantasy duology I have been working on for years, is just one view of autism, sifted through the experiences of myself and people I know. She's very cathartic for me to write and develop because I could create the kind of representation I want to see in the world for the autistic community because, yes, representation is important to all identities and communities, especially those that are vastly diverse or misunderstood, like autism. I guess I should cover a brief background on the lore of her character before diving in. Also, this was my first time trying out digital art, let alone recording it, and also the first time I've ever tried to visualize any of my characters, but I thought, hey, if I'm gonna be ranting about one of my characters, y'all deserve at least some kind of visual of her while I yap. Andra, being from a fantasy world, is not human, but instead a magic race known as Mutatla. To be clear, Mutatla look just like humans. They have animal-based magic, which is pretty big cultural divide between them and humans. And unlike the rest of the magical main cast, often called the Pack since the narrator of these stories has wolf-based magic, Andra wasn't born in the oppressive human settlement known as Mendasium, instead growing up in a magic-friendly military encampment in the wilds. She was raised as a soldier and trained to be a nurse, but after turning 17, some pretty traumatic events happen, as they often do, and she ends up in Mendasium, meeting the rest of the pack and quickly becoming their leader as they decide to travel off into the wilderness to escape dangerous Mendasium and find more folks with magic. Yes, I am indeed aware that this is a bit cringy and angsty, but hey, I created these concepts when I was just 15, so, please be nice. Now, as for Andra being autistic representation, first off, she is a person of color, around 17 to 18 years old when the books takes place, and she is, well, a she. Autistic women are not as represented in awareness and media compared to men, and are unproportionately undiagnosed regarding their autism. In fact, it was a misconception for many years that autism could only affect boys, leaving a lot of girls in a state of lonely and exhausting masking. So, as much as any autistic representation can have the potential to be beneficial regardless of gender, I say potential here because there's also definitely been a lot of harmful autistic representation, I kind of like the idea of both of my autistic OCs being female because, yeah, women deserve some space and recognition too, guys. Also, while it is hard to state an explicit ethnicity for Andra in the books because, fantasy world, I've always pictured her as being someone likely of indigenous descent. This is actually important in regards to autism because the majority of autistic representation is also white. And even though autism is actually pretty common, if not more common, in people of color, I guess my main point here is we need more diverse autistic representation, and I am more than happy to pitch in on that front. I tried making Andra's portrayal of autism subtle but undeniable. That is to say, having autism is not her whole character, or even the main focus of her character arc or plot, but she wouldn't quite be herself without it, either. It does have a role in shaping some of her actions and reactions, but there's also more to her personality and development than just, I have autism. Examples of how her autism does show up, as recorded by Evelyn, Andra's best friend and the narrator of these stories, include, of course, multiple mentions of her not making eye contact in conversation, Andra not being social except with a few select individuals she's bonded with, her intelligence being rooted more in logic and survival than emotional understanding, her tendency to be less outwardly emotive, though that doesn't mean she is emotionless, more on that later, Her appreciation of organization and routine, her heightened senses even compared to the rest of her species, her verbal shutdowns, and her participation in parallel play, which is when people do separate activities side by side instead of together, such as Andra joining the rest of the pack by the campfire, but working on her whittling instead of conversing. But part of this generally more subtle showing of autism is due to the fact she wasn't intentionally written as autistic at first. Hard to believe, I know, but I didn't sit down and just decide to create an autistic character. I just wanted to make a relatable character, who ended up being very autistic coded the more she developed. So I eventually decided to just make it canon and lean into it because, honestly, why not? I love seeing good representation. Why would I possibly want to hold back from it? What makes Andra interesting as representation to me is that she's mostly seen from an outside perspective, since the books are, again, narrated by 15-year-old Evelyn, someone who is definitely not omniscient. What this means is that most of the time, we don't get to see into Andra's head or thoughts, making her more neurodivergent behaviors, especially her verbal shutdowns, all the more complexing at times, since it does take Evelyn and the others a while to understand why she does what she does. This is cool to me because it can deepen reader comprehension of what autism can look like and how it should and shouldn't be treated by others. However, Andra does have one section, about halfway through the first book, where she takes over narrating the story, covering her backstory and some of the events we've already seen, but now from her own perspective and explanation, showing more of her thoughts and reasoning and some of the numerous communication clashes between her and the rest of the pack. Here in her narration is also the first and currently only time she explains autism, as she says this about her training days. "It wasn't always easy for me, though. I got distracted, I couldn't always understand orders or the other soldiers, and I often favored a silent existence, sometimes by choice, but sometimes I found my voice slipping away from me, denying me its use. Gustavo worried I wouldn't be able to keep up with what I had to do, but Darlene assured him nothing was wrong, necessarily. I was just a bit different from what was expected of me. And the way I saw things didn't always line up with the way others saw them." Now, I'm aware that her never explicitly citing autism might take a few points off from being good representation, but the reason I did this was because it didn't feel like the word autism would fit smoothly into the fantasy world that she resides in, and using it would feel more forced or out of place since would the word autism even exist in a world like this? My conclusion was it wouldn't, so this is frankly the closest we get to having a direct conversation about it. The rest is shown through her actions and interactions. Speaking of interactions, Andra's autism does have an effect at times on her relationships, as it often can in real life. She has both positive and negative interactions with authority figures in her upbringing because of it. It caused a strain between her and one of her superior officers when she was in training, since he was very hard on her and saw autism as something wrong with her that she needed to change or get rid of. But someone else who was involved in raising her learned and then taught Andra a form of sign language to help her communicate when she experiences verbal shutdowns, which brought them closer together. Autism sometimes brings up challenges in Andra's bond with the rest of the pack and her other peers, but it never goes so far as to kill off the friendships she's made. The clearest example of this is in the evolution of Andra's relationship with another character from the main cast, Chris, a fellow teen girl, Mutatla, and the absolute rain on everyone's parade. Chris starts out straight up bullying Andra, accusing her of not trying or having any care for the rest of them, or blaming her for the dangerous situations the pack ends up in. But throughout their travels and troubles that they've survived together, Andra and Chris do gain a better understanding and even respect for each other, especially as it comes to the surface that they're both trauma victims. And while it starts out as awkward, Chris does eventually apologize. Here's a snippet from that scene. "I won't be able to understand you all the time. Not really. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't be in your corner." Chris sighed, pinching her eyes shut. "I shouldn't have treated you like that," she said finally. "No matter what, same or different, whether I knew what you were going through or not. Look, what I'm trying to say is I'm sorry." To summarize the rest of it, Andra in turn apologizes for a lie she told, teaches Chris a bit of sign language, and the two part ways on much more friendly terms with simply this line. Chris sat in silence for a moment before reaching out with her left hand to shake. How about we both try to just be a bit better? Because I think that's really important. Andra doesn't have to fully change who she is to make things easier for others, nor does Chris or any of the other pack members. They all just need to try to put in a little extra patience and understanding. If this means the rest of the pack picks up on a bit of sign language, or Andra works on ways to better articulate her emotions and ask for help, then that's what can happen to make things better for everyone involved. Another example of a key relationship for Andra and perspective on autism is probably the most prominent and the most important. Evelyn, the narrator of the story and Andra's best friend, and eventually queer platonic partner for those who know what that is. Let me know if you want a future video on just that. The first introduction that both Evelyn and readers get to Andra is the quote-unquote weird quiet girl beating the shit out of her bully, and barely a chapter or so later is Andra revealed to be Mutatla, making her one of the first Mutatla peers Evelyn has ever had. So, to no surprise, Andra is initially seen by Evelyn, and again, readers, as this almost dangerous mystery, someone unpredictable, secretive, and hard to understand. But as the events of the story play out, it's not long before Evelyn and Andra become closer and each other's most trusted friend. Evelyn becomes the best at reading Andra, and is typically the most supportive out of the main cast. She picks up on the subtleties in Andra's body language, takes time to explain social aspects or unfamiliar phrases when Andra doesn't understand, respects how much she values her walking stick and her frequent personal space, is willing to be patient and quiet when Andra struggles to find the right words to open up, and even learns some sign language for her. It gets to the point where both Evelyn and Andra are on the same frequency, so much so that they don't often need to ask each other for help, because the other will already be offering what they can tell they need. A key feature, though, in this relationship regarding Andra, Evelyn, and autism is that Evelyn makes it clear she doesn't see Andra as someone who is incapable of functioning on her own, because Evelyn is more than aware that Andra is capable of taking care of herself, but Evelyn also knows that Andra does benefit from help sometimes. She respects her boundaries and independence, but is also always there for her when she needs support, emotionally, mentally, or even physically. Andra was strong before meeting the pack, but it's only with help from Evelyn and the rest of them that Andra gets to unlock her full potential. Now, emotions and emotional bonds are actually very important to me in this subject. Andra undeniably has emotions, and clearly has strong emotional bonds, as I already started to explain. Sounds like a strange thing to make a big deal out of, but autism is often portrayed as emotionless, calculating, or psychopathic. But Andra experiences a wide scale of emotions, complex ones at that. She's much more quiet about them, less open and expressive, but when paying close attention, she is far from being an emotionless robot. She feels a deep grief over the people she's lost, a strong sense of duty and responsibility for what she thinks is right, an unbreakable connection to her friends to the point she is willing to risk her life for them, guilt for lying to the people she cares about, and a grappling confusion over her sense of self and identity. She truly enjoys the company of the rest of the pack, finding their presence comforting even if she doesn't always join their conversations or smile all the time. She has compassion for those who are suffering, especially when they're her friends, but instead of showering them in sympathetic tears or words, she usually tries to cut through directly to what they need so she can help them. Since she's a doctor and a survivalist, this typically involves looking after their physical needs first, but she does show she is capable of caring for their emotions as well. This can sometimes look a bit detached from an outside perspective, since she isn't often outwardly expressing her concern, but she expresses through her actions, and those actions prove just how devoted she is to the people she cares about. Examples of this include when the pack is trapped in a cave after an avalanche, where instead of consoling a crying friend, Andra jumps into action to start digging them out. Or how even when in mid-argument with a friend, she treats her wounds gently as a sign of continuing and underlying goodwill between them, despite their severe moral disagreement. Or when she set aside her usual dislike of physical touch to hold Evelyn as she came down from a panic attack. She doesn't say anything, but they all know she doesn't need to. Her presence speaks volumes for how much she cares. Yes, even if it isn't super obvious, Andra is drowning in her emotions. She has a severe struggle with her mental health, which plays a large role in her character arc. She feels isolated, purposeless, without a sense of self outside the roles she plays, and there's a good heap of survivor's guilt thrown in there too. Sadly, the rest of the pack doesn't notice her struggle until it's almost too late. But thankfully they do notice, and they help her not only physically recover, but start the much longer mental recovery journey. What's even sadder is severe mental health struggle is no stranger to the autistic community, where rates of poor mental health and, yes, even attempts to end one's own life are significantly higher. I was hesitant at first to draw Andra's story to such a dark place, but something pulled me to writing it the way it is, and I've realized it's because it's a story that needs to be told. People, both neurodivergent and neurotypical, need to hear and to understand they aren't alone, and they can get through this. Which is why, as Andra admits, she assumed the pack would leave her behind after seeing just how supposedly broken it feels. Evelyn takes her hand and says, "It's okay. We still need you. We still want you here. You're more than just a soldier, you're our friend." Congratulations on making it through this video. I thank you for sticking around for my absolute unorganized nonsense, and I hope you possibly found some enjoyment along the way. Remember, autism looks different for everyone, and we're all valid as human beings. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.